As I'm sure you're all aware, we're kind of meeting here just a couple of hours after Vladimir Putin has announced the illegal annexation of 4 more regions of eastern Ukraine. We know it's been denounced in Europe and elsewhere as a sham, and further sanctions are likely to follow, but I guess we want to be asking, what does it mean for Ukraine? What does it mean for the war? And what does it mean for Europe's response to everything that's happened really since the Russian invasion, including, of course, what it calls Russia's energy war against Europe itself. So let me introduce our panelists. What we'll do is I'll ask the panelists to speak for a few minutes each, then we'll have a discussion, and obviously we'll welcome any questions. So from the far side, Victor Mallet is a journalist and commentator from the Financial Times with more than 3 decades of experience in Europe and many other places in the world. You notice I got 25 years, you've got more than 30, which makes you even more of a veteran than me, which is great for me anyway. For the last few years, until recently, Victor has been the FT's Paris bureau chief on a sort of sabbatical at the moment, but has spent the last few years covering France and various parts of Western Europe. Hannah Lucinda Smith lives in the marvellous city of Istanbul, one of my former stomping grounds. She writes for The Times, for Monocle, among others. She also wrote the book Erdogan Rising, a warning to Europe about President Tayyip Erdogan. I'm sure she'll have some words to say about him. And she has another book, Zarifa, which was published only yesterday. So congratulations for that. And Michael Bosicki is hot off a plane from Vancouver, so if he falls asleep, I'll sort of nudge him a bit. He is a global affairs analyst, normally based in Lviv, also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and a former spokesperson in Ukraine for the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I believe many happy returns are in order, so happy birthday, Michael. And as someone based in Ukraine, maybe I can start with you. If you could just speak for a few minutes on, I guess,
sure.
We knew that the announcement of the illegal annexation was coming. In that sense, it's not a surprise. The setup of Putin making an angry speech is not a surprise. And yet it still feels like quite a big moment.
Right. Thank you for having me. Great to be here. It's nice to be here in person because the previous times I've been a guest panelist at the Convo Club has been on the screen from Ukraine. I've actually now moved from Lviv to Odessa for a number of reasons, but one of them is I'm closer to the front line. Speaking of falling asleep, on this overnight flight that I took, I forgot to turn off the air raid siren alarm for Odessa, and in the middle of the night, it goes off and wakes up the entire cabin of the aircraft. I wasn't the most popular person on there, but the reason I say that is because it's a constant thing now. Even though cities like Odessa may not be struck, these air raid sirens do go off often, and it's the women and children who are most impacted by that, the anxiety that is caused. And one more point before I get to Putin's speech is the new phenomenon now we're seeing in Odessa, which has remained relatively unscathed in this full-scale invasion, is the appearance of Iranian-built kamikaze drones. The other day, they paid a visit to Odessa port and destroyed the administration building. That is supposed to be sacred ground, according to this grain deal that was struck between Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, and the United Nations. So that's going to be, I think, going forward, a new technique of the Russians. They're doing terribly, as you know, on the battlefield. The men they send are basically cannon fodder. So I think we're going to see a bit of a switch on battlefield tactics to these kamikaze drones, but as well as a continuation of these horrible long-range missiles that have struck as far as Lviv, the Ukrainian-Polish border, Yavorov. And this is the Russian playbook. If they can't achieve their goals on the battlefield, they'll pummel cities, towns, and villages. And indeed, I think it was just a few hours ago, a humanitarian convoy in occupied Zaporizhia that was traveling to go outside of the city was struck. The numbers keep on rising, but in terms of civilian deaths, I think we're at around 25 and about 25 to 30 injuries according to Ukrainian officials. So I frequently say as soon as we thought we've seen the basement or the bottom floor of Russian inhumanity, they tend to surprise us, and we see even worse things happening. Putin's speech today was another rant, blaming the West for everything that's wrong in Russia, creating more resentment towards the West. There weren't many surprises, but what we did get confirmation of was the forced annexation of these 4 regions, Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. It now appears as well that they're not only going to be attempting to claim the occupied parts of the Donbass, but the 2/3 that they don't occupy. And I think it was Peskov who said, a spokesperson for the Kremlin, that these areas will have to be conquered. But it's a very, very bad development. I think that the only way the West can respond is through, of course, unity, but also strength. And by strength, I don't mean rhetoric coming from Macron or the White House or whoever. And I don't think sanctions are going to be the only tool that will do it to push Putin back. What the Ukrainians are saying is that what they need is, of course, more weaponry, more ammunition, more tanks, more helicopters. That is slowly coming, but it isn't enough. And I think as well what we're going to be seeing, we're already seeing it actually, is the war turning into a high-tech war where the Ukrainians can strike also with drones, but from more of a distance and with more accuracy. So that is very good, because I think that will lessen their deaths on the battlefield. As for the 300,000 men that are being drafted, I believe 100,000 have now been mobilized. I think this is going to be cannon fodder, sad to say, that many of them will return home in boxes. And when you get a big enough army of angry mothers, you have a big problem on your hands. So that's why I said on BBC World the other day that this move, I think, is going to be a very destabilizing factor for Mr. Putin. Another thing I'd like to say, and give me a kick to the shins if I go on for too long, is that I think the reason Mr. Putin thinks he can get away with this new annexation is because of 2014. He got away with it with Crimea and also in the Donbass. I was there on the ground with the OSCE in Donetsk. It was a surreal situation, but we were in the city hall of Donetsk city. Half of the building was occupied, well, not occupied, but there were people there from the elected administration. And then the other half of the building had these so-called little green men in it, looking very menacing and also heavily armed. So it's really amazing to see this happen in real time. We saw it with our own eyes. And the very last moments that we were in Donetsk, the thing that was kind of the signal that they were getting ahead of the Ukrainians was they hoisted the so-called Donetsk People's Republic flag above the airport. And I turned to our ambassador, Apakan, at the time and said, I think this is it for those territories. So again, the speech is predictable, but I think the West has to take it very, very seriously. The only thing Mr. Putin understands is strength, and it won't be just sanctions and rhetoric that does it this time.
Michael, thank you very much. I should have actually said at the beginning that we were also due to be joined live from Kyiv by Kavita Sharma, who's a correspondent in Ukraine for the German television channel RTL, but as you probably won't be surprised, she's a bit busy today. Fortunately, we did assume that might be the case, and so a couple of days ago I recorded a couple of clips with her, so we will be able to hear at least some of her thoughts. And just to add, the plan that we should be joined live in about 45 minutes by another German journalist, Katrin Prebel, who's based in Brussels, where EU energy ministers have been meeting today to talk about Russia, Ukraine and gas supplies. So we'll hopefully get her perspective. But first of all, Michael mentioned the Ukrainian demand, the Ukrainian need for military supplies. And it was something that I asked Kavita about when I spoke to her before we knew actually that the annexation announcement was being made today. Eddie, could we play that clip?
We have heard time and time again in the course of this war how intensely and how big the gratitude is for the support coming from European countries. And of course the government in Kiev knows very clearly that they need more and a continuous flow of weapons from the West in order to defend Ukraine, in order to reclaim territory. And this is why, for instance, the lightning counteroffensive in the northeast, it was so important for the government in Kiev, because in the end it showed how well the Ukrainian military managed to advance, how well the different sort of parts played together, how effective they used Western-made weapons. And it's of course a big argument for continued weapons deliveries that Ukraine needs. But of course, the successes of the Northeast can't necessarily be repeated elsewhere. What we're seeing in the South is a grinding, is a bloody, is a slow battle. What we're seeing in the South, in Kherson, it's also looking rather difficult for the Ukrainian army. Actually, the New York Times, for instance, reported that they had lots and lots of losses in the South as part of their counteroffensive. So all this is to say, the Ukrainian army, they need continued support to secure the gains that they have made, but also in order to successfully push forward. And the Ukrainian government knows that very well, but is also extremely grateful for the support that they have been getting so far.
I mean, there's been lots of expressions of gratitude, but they'd like more, wouldn't they? And particularly, they'd like more from Germany in terms of actual physical military hardware.
Absolutely. And I think the Ukrainians know very well who their actual friends are, or who they consider their actual friends. The other day, we spoke to a Ukrainian soldier. This was shortly after the liberation of Izium. And he said to us, Poland gave us, for instance, a lot of weapons, but Germany should give us more, should help us more. In particular, he was referring to modern Western tanks, the Leopard 2 tanks that Germany has not thus far delivered to Ukraine. He said in English, so I understand that, Mr. Scholz, it's time for you to decide for good and against evil. Yeah, and Germany's response in general in the course of this war has been widely criticized, not just by Ukraine, also by its allies, for doing too little, for sitting on the fence. Ukrainians at times who we spoke to, they simply questioned Germany's solidarity. At the moment, we are at a point where Germany is delivering howitzers, where Germany is delivering multiple rocket launch systems. But yeah, I mean, as the soldier touched on, who we spoke in Izium, there is now another discussion. Ukraine wants Germany to deliver Leopard 2 tanks, modern Western tanks. The German government stands as well. No other NATO ally is delivering these sort of tanks. And yeah, the Ukrainian government response to that is to say, well, Germany should be a country that leads, not a country that follows. Germany in turn says, well, we have this exchange system going whereby, older Soviet-style tanks are being delivered to Ukraine, and the countries that are delivering them, they're getting new German tanks. But the point is, for many Ukrainians we speak to, they don't understand why Germany is not simply delivering them the kind of weapons that they're asking for.
And where do you think that German hesitancy springs from? And obviously, there's been very strong diplomatic, political support from Olaf Scholz and others. But what is it that Germany seems to fear about what a Ukrainian victory might entail?
Well, I think first, and that's something that Scholz always says also, is there is a fear that at some point NATO and of course Germany could be seen as being a party in this conflict. There is a fear that, this could ignite a wider war. And when you speak to the German public, there is a fear of a nuclear escalation. And Putin, of course, knows of all those fears. He is stoking these fears. That's his aim, and he knows fine well that he is exerting pressure through, creating this threatening scenario. But and I would also say, historically, Germany has had a foreign policy that is more about wait and see. We don't want to get involved. We're acting in accordance with our allies. All this is, of course, going back to the Second World War. So I think now this war is forcing Germany really to reassess its role on the sort of international stage to decide what they want to do and where they want to go, what sort of role they want to take. And for the public, and also to communicate that to the public effectively, because I think what is happening in Germany right now, that at least some part of society is asking themselves, well, why should we basically, why should we support a war, or is there no other way to solve it? I sometimes get asked, for instance, could Ukraine not simply accept certain losses of territory, which is of course to Ukraine an offensive thing to say, something they would never accept. But from the German perspective, at least in some parts of the society, the German perspective is driven by fear and worry.
So that was speaking in Kyiv 2 days ago. I thought one of the most interesting lines was the Ukrainian view that Germany should be a country that leads, not a country that follows.
Could I just add a couple more sentences very, very quickly, sorry. In terms of what Ukraine needs, again, the ability to strike down those long-range incoming missiles. I'm told right now, if, for example, you have 6 missiles headed towards Odessa, Ukrainians now have the possibility to shoot down about 4 of them. But they need more of that technology. Ideally, an Iron Dome system, that will never be given to them. But I do understand that Washington is providing Kyiv with the protective technology, the same kind of umbrella that, for example, protects Washington, D.C. And then one more point, very, very quickly. The other thing about this forced annexation is a very absurd potential situation, is that the residents of these absorbed areas, even though they can be very pro-Ukrainian, there's a good chance that they're going to be conscripted, they're going to be forced to the fight line and put a position where they're going to be told to fire at their brethren on the Ukrainian side. It's that obscene of a situation that we could be headed into. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point, Michael. Thank you. We had a bit of the perspective of someone who reports for outlets in Germany. What's it look like from Paris and the rest of Western Europe? What are the thought processes at the moment about how to respond to the war?
I don't think Western Europe as a whole has really absorbed how significant this is. I mean, French President Emmanuel Macron is constantly emphasizing, we have war at the gates of Europe, we really have to take this seriously. But I don't think people on the whole are quite aware of how serious it is. I mean, you have a permanent member of the UN Security Council invading a sovereign state, and obviously that means that the UN Security Council can't say much about it without a Russian veto. And then you have this massive Second World War style war, except with better weapons and newer weapons, on very much some of the same territory that the Nazis fought the Soviets over in Ukraine and Western Russia. And I don't know if any of you have read Vasily Grossman's book on, well, there were 2. There was the Stalingrad one, and then there was the Life and Fate, which was the kind of the sequel. And I only read that after the beginning of the conflict, because one of my colleagues, John Thornhill, who was a former Moscow bureau chief, said, you have to read this to understand what's going on. And the extraordinary thing is that Putin seems to be making some of the same mistakes that Hitler made, second-guessing his generals and telling them not to retreat when they really want to retreat to save their troops, and so on. But when you look at Western Europe, and I think this applies to the UK as well as the EU, I don't think people have quite understood the gravity of the situation. I mean, it was obvious, we then get onto the whole question of energy. I mean, it was pretty obvious, I thought, from day one, that Germany in particular, but the rest of Europe, would have to wean itself off Russian gas and oil. And we know, obviously, it's very hard to do immediately, but I think most of the EU members were quite slow to sort of anticipate how quickly they would have to do that. And they have now taken action, but of course there were problems with countries like Hungary under Viktor Orban, which is reluctant both to impose sanctions and to deprive themselves of Russian energy supplies. So we're in a situation now where it's not clear how ready people are to make the kind of sacrifices that they're going to need to make. And I think there's a big question as to how serious those sacrifices really are. We had an article in the FT the other day that was pointing out that the gap that hasn't already been filled in gas supplies could simply be met by lowering our indoor heating temperatures by 3 degrees centigrade. to 18, no, I think to 19 degrees centigrade. Well, I just left my mum's house in Kent, and she's 92, and her temperature is at 18 degrees centigrade. So, this is not actually a huge sacrifice that people have to make. But I don't think anyone has quite sort of absorbed this. And in a way, what we see is a whole bunch of chickens coming home to roost. Germany very dependent on Russia for its energy supplies. Germany very dependent also on China for its exports of industrial products. And the whole of Europe sort of having been, well, especially France, because it has nuclear power, been quite slow to invest in renewable energy, which they are now trying to accelerate rather belatedly, but of course that won't come on stream for at least a couple of years. So you have and then there's the economy situation, which we're seeing particularly here in the UK. Of course, in order to make these investments in new energy, renewable energy, you need money. In order to buy the gas from the rest of the world, where the price has gone up, you also need money. And we've been living in this kind of cloud cuckoo land since 2008, really, of extremely low interest rates, extremely cheap money. Governments, including most major EU governments, have been able to borrow at negative rates of interest. In other words, they've been able to be paid to borrow money, and that has very suddenly come to a dramatic end. And so, the consequences of that sort of lack of economic foresight, combined with the need to pay for very expensive imported energy from new sources, and the lack of investment in countries like France in offshore wind, for example, which they're now starting to do, has really sort of come home. And I just think the big question now is whether Western European citizens and governments are really prepared to understand that they, in order to continue with the war effort, and it is, let's face it, a war effort. Their troops are not fighting, but they are absolutely behind the Ukrainians in governmental terms anyway. And of course, we talked a bit about weapons, but don't forget that probably the most important thing that the West is supplying to Ukraine is intelligence and satellite surveillance. And I mean, it's pretty clear that a lot of the things that the Ukrainians are able to do are because of US and NATO intelligence support for telling them what the Russians are doing and where they should go and where they shouldn't go. So anyway, so we're in a kind of very, very risky situation. You spoke about the nuclear threat, I think, just now, and we have to. I think every European government, including the British government, which is no longer in the EU, are going to have to buckle down and think about what might be a war economy. Just a brief point about weapons supplies, which we were talking about just now. One of the sort of chickens coming home to roost, that one of the failures that are only now being identified is this issue of how many weapons do we have? I mean, I was quite impressed by the number of anti-tank weapons that the British were able to supply to the Ukrainians. The French supplied a quarter of all their howitzers to, which is not very many. I mean, I think it's 18 to the Ukrainians. There is simply not a large amount of ammunition. There is not a large amount of weaponry out there because people have not been spending very much on defense, and they haven't been spending very much on ammunition. There are very few places which are manufacturing the kind of ammunition that the Ukrainians need. This is a massive conflict. I think that the front line is about 1,000 miles long. Both sides are shelling each other like crazy. The Russians more than the Ukrainians, because until now they've had more ammunition to expend. But even with the HIMARS and these fancy multiple rocket launchers from America, there is just a need for a massive quantity of materiel, which I think the West is discovering that it's having difficulty in supplying. So that's something not to forget. It's not just a lack of willingness on the part of the Germans and others to supply weapons. It's that they don't actually have very many there. That's probably, I'll leave it there. There's lots of other things we can discuss.
No, that's great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, a good reminder that whatever Europe does, I guess, Ukraine will remain heavily dependent on the United States. Hannah, I should have mentioned that you were also heavily involved in covering the invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014. Is that?
No, I reported from Crimea after that.
I've been misinformed by Pranvera. No, okay, I should have asked you yourself, but you will. Yeah. Anyway, Turkey is because Turkey's role is obviously interesting in a development that probably surprises no one. President Erdogan is playing both sides. How effective, how real is the role as mediator? Is it partly Turkey seeing an opportunity to massively increase its trade with Russia, which obviously has happened since European sanctions began to bite in? And how concerned do you think Turkey will be by the announcement of illegal annexations, which are happening, after all, just on the other side of the Black Sea?
Yeah, well, the war in Ukraine's presented a really huge opportunity for Turkey, or actually more specifically for Erdogan. Yeah. If you look back to the start of the year, I mean, he almost couldn't get a handshake at international conferences. He was, almost openly being kind of blanked by particularly President Biden. And with the start of the war in Ukraine, all of a sudden he's one of the most important leaders in the world for the West. But he's not been playing both sides. He's been playing three sides in this. So I'll outline the three positions and then I'll explain why this annexation is a really big problem for him at this point. So first of all, there's the pro-Ukrainian side. So on paper, Turkey is an ally of Ukraine. It absolutely opposed the annexation of Crimea in 2014. That's partly because Crimea has a population of Tatars who are Muslim. They also speak a Turkic language. Turkey is very, very connected to the kind of Turkic communities abroad, has very, very strong links with the Crimean Tatar. Also, Turkish drones have been used to quite great effect by the Ukrainian army. Some people say it's overstated, but certainly if you look on social media, you'll find all kinds of Ukrainian songs praising the Bayraktar drone. So Bayraktar is a company that's owned by one of Erdogan's son-in-laws. So it's a very politically connected company. And this is forming the core of Turkey's kind of support to Ukraine. So as far as we know, Bayraktar himself is very personally, feels very strongly personally about the Ukraine war, is very much on the side of the Ukrainians. And this is what's kind of propping up, let's say, the pro-Ukrainian leg of Turkish policy in Ukraine. Then on the other side, you've obviously got Turkey's relations with Russia. Now, this is really based around Erdogan's personal relationship with Putin, which obviously he's been nurturing for a number of years. Putin, on the other hand, has been nurturing his relationship with Erdogan as a way to kind of get at the West, to cause these constant sort of debates within NATO. Is Turkey a reliable NATO partner? Is Turkey about to leave NATO? But for Erdogan at this point, what's really, really useful in this relationship is Russian money. So Erdogan's met Putin 3 times since the start of the Ukrainian conflict. One of those was in Sochi last month. And in that meeting, he made it very, very clear Turkey is open for Russian business. Not only have there been a lot of Russians coming to Turkey since the start of the conflict, and particularly since the mobilization earlier this month, places like Antalya and Istanbul absolutely full of Russians, but also oligarchs have been parking their yachts in the marinas there. They've also been sniffing around for places to invest their money, to move their money out of Europe and out of Russia and into Turkey. Also, things like companies that want to keep trading with Europe, Russian companies setting up subsidiaries in Turkey to be able to do that. Clearly, there comes a point when the US is not too happy about this. I think for quite a while, the US was sort of willing to overlook this to a certain extent, but in recent weeks, it's been making clearer and clearer that there will come a point when Turkey might face secondary sanctions. And in fact, the US Treasury has already sent out warning letters to Turkish business associations saying, if you do business with sanctioned individuals or companies, you run the risk of secondary sanctions from the US. But that's proved incredibly useful for Erdogan. He's facing an election next year. The economy is in absolute crisis. Turkey has been burning through its foreign reserves to keep the lira propped up. And that's left a huge hole in its coffers, which has been partly filled, not totally filled, by Russian cash. Also, it looks like in Turkey we're not going to be facing the same energy crisis because Putin looks like he's going to offer some kind of guarantees on energy prices for Turkey. So obviously that's going to be really useful for Erdogan. Now the third leg is the in-between. It's the mediation role. So this is the role that has really boosted Erdogan's standing, if not in private, then at least publicly, with NATO, with the US, and particularly with the UN. So, as well as managing to bring Russian and Ukrainian delegations together for talks in March, which went nowhere, also Turkey managed to mediate the grain deal that got those ships moving again from the Ukrainian ports after 5 months. Now, it was really interesting watching the signing of that because Antonio Guterres kind of bent over backwards to say thank you to Erdogan, right? In fact, it's not the efforts of Erdogan, it's the efforts of Turkish diplomats, particularly a guy called Ibrahim Kalin, Erdogan's spokesman, a really, really experienced foreign policy hand. These are the guys who've been doing all the legwork on that, but of course it's Erdogan that has been, taking the credit for it and, reaping the rewards on the world stage. Now, that's been kind of, rolling along okay for him. There's been some tensions, particularly with the US being unhappy about, the extent to which Russia is still doing business in Turkey. But now the annexation of these 4 areas really puts Erdogan in a bind. He's spoken to both Zelensky and to Putin this week. He spoke to Zelensky on Wednesday by phone. He spoke to Putin yesterday. Now, the statements that have come out from the Turkish presidency about this are couched in quite bland language. They talk, first of all, about how great it is that they've managed to oversee a prisoner swap recently, the grain deal carrying on going. And then basically Erdogan, the way he has put it, or the way that the presidency has put it, is that it's not helping the diplomatic efforts. Now, really, Erdogan cannot in any way be seen to support this annexation. It would go entirely against Turkish policy up to this point. But also, he still needs to keep Putin on side, because this money, this Russian money that's coming into the Turkish system is really important to him. So I think what's happened today could actually prove to be the breaking point for this, 3-legged policy in the Ukrainian conflict that Erdogan's managed to keep rolling on so far.
Great, thanks very much. I'll take questions from the floor in a minute, but I just have, so please do store them up. I just want to ask a couple myself because I'm greedy. Michael, I wanted to ask you about one thing in particular in terms of European policy, and that is the idea of visa restrictions. Because until a few weeks ago, it was seen as something as a way to punish Russia, to not allow rich Russians to reap the benefits of coming on holiday on the Mediterranean and so forth. Now it could be about preventing people who are fleeing from the prospect of being called up and mobilised. What do you think is the best policy, or what do you think Europe should do in terms of the debate about visa restrictions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was asked about this on air the other day. Look, I've never been an advocate of imposing sanctions that kind of hurt the common man or the average family, but I think in this case it has to be done. The other aspect of this, of course, is with, I think the number fleeing is approaching 300,000 right now. A lot, by the way, people from the high-tech sector, Russia's best and brightest, if you will. But the other thing European countries have to be cognizant of is actually who is coming into these countries. People who instigate some of Putin's orders or infiltrators, things like that. I would not put it beyond the Russians that they deliberately send people out and they pose as refugees or whatever, asylum seekers, and then they cause a lot of trouble for Europe on behalf of Russia. On the topic of, and I think that this needs to be done because I don't think sanctions have had the desired effect. And by the way, to give you an idea of how quickly this story is moving, just as you guys were talking, 2 headlines came over, U.S. administration announcing more swift and severe sanctions for Russia, including the Putin inner circle. Well, I'm sorry, but I thought they did that quite a few months ago. Yeah. The other headline, just quickly, is that Zelensky is now going to ask, surprised me a bit, for NATO membership on an expedited basis, fast-track basis. But I think if these restrictions do hit a lot of Russians, we will have a lot of anger, disenchantment. They love going to Turkey, as you know, to other places, Dubai. But I think in order to tighten this noose, and I've said this many times as well, is you have to get some of the Gulf countries involved as well, the Qatars of the world, UAE, the Maldives, places the Russians like to go. One last point on movement of people. I've spent a little bit of time before this panel in various countries where Ukrainians have fled. And what is happening there with this war going into month 7 or 8, a lot of the privileges, a lot of the visa kind of points that they had are now expiring. So what's happening is a lot of Ukrainians are not voluntarily, but because of economic necessity, going back to Ukraine and often to dangerous areas. In Toronto and Vancouver, for example, we have some of the most highest rental rates in the world, believe it or not. Ukrainians just can't afford to live there anymore, so they're coming back. So it's a big problem, and I mention this because the West has to deal with this also in terms of policy. This war is not going away. In fact, I hate to say it, I think it'll get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's probably right. Victor, we talked a bit about France and Germany. We haven't yet mentioned Italy, which, another import which is about to have its most right-wing government since the Second World War. Any thoughts on that? But also, we haven't mentioned Eastern Europe, and obviously the Baltic states, Poland, are taking a much more aggressive, I don't know if hardline is the right word, but a more aggressive approach, along with the UK, than perhaps France and Germany, who are more cautious. What can you tell us about I suppose, the tensions behind the diplomatic niceties within Europe between East and West on how to respond to Ukraine and to Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I think briefly, the kind of, if you like, the more moderate or the sort of the big countries like France and Germany have kind of come round more to Poland and the Baltic states' point of view as the war has progressed, and all the atrocities have emerged and so on. The problem is actually probably not Poland at the moment. It's more Hungary, where you have Viktor Orban is I think today or yesterday, last night, he basically talked about. He suggested that he was not going to let the EU prolong sanctions beyond the current 6 months, which obviously is very serious, and there will be negotiations and so on. But I think, in a way, that's a bigger division now, is with the countries, well, mainly Hungary, that are dependent on Russian energy supplies and are less reluctant to confront Putin or to apply sanctions. On Giorgia Meloni and Italy, it's kind of there was an article by Timothy Garton-Ash today in the FT, which was quite interesting, basically saying if you want to look for fascism in Europe, don't look to Italy, look to Russia, look to Putin, not to Meloni. And I think that's quite an important point, because she actually, unlike Marine Le Pen, for example, in France, the head of the far-right French party, the Rassemblement National, Meloni has actually been quite Atlanticist, quite pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia in her political campaigning. So she differs in that sense from the French far right, which was always, at least prior to the election and prior to the invasion, very sympathetic to Putin, and in fact indebted financially to Putin personally and for her party. So there are kind of various tensions. I think so far the EU has actually held together pretty well, but I think just to come back on the issue of sanctions, the really important sanctions are the economic sanctions, the sanctions on energy. The sanctions against individuals are really for show. I mean, they are, designed to show that we're doing something by keeping out these terrible Russian billionaires that, in fact, we in the UK and indeed other countries in Europe have welcomed with open arms because of their money. And now we're saying, well, we're going to take your money and your yachts and please go home. But it's very much a sort of propaganda effort, if you like, and of course inevitably these people are ending up in Marmaris and southern Turkey, Antalya, where they do indeed have their. I was in Marmaris quite recently, and they have their very large super yachts in the bays there, because it's the only place just about in West or in Europe where I think they can go. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just take one question for Hannah and then questions from the floor. You talked about this kind of the three legs of the stool, and the stool's going to fall over soon in terms of Turkish policy. Can you see anyone who's better placed, given that all wars in the end have to end with some kind of negotiation? Can you think of anyone better placed than Turkey?
No.
That's the problem, isn't it?
That's the problem. Well, for Erdogan, that's the opportunity.
Yeah.
Here's the interesting thing. He's very, very skilled at domestic politics, but he's never been a particularly skilled leader in terms of foreign politics and foreign policy. But I think, he has spotted an opportunity here, or his diplomats have spotted an opportunity here. And, Turkey for a long time has been saying that it wants to play this kind of mediation role in the world, not just in this conflict, but in other conflicts as well. It does occupy this geographical position. It's sort of in the centre of a lot of competing spheres of interest.
Like Ukraine.
like Ukraine, right? But, what other leaders in the world have the kind of relationship that Erdogan does with Zelensky and with Putin? I can't think of anyone else. I mean, the relationship with Zelensky has come under some strain in the past couple of months, because I think the Ukrainians realise very well that Turkey is not a kind of full-blooded ally, and that it is sort of looking for its own interests. But, he's managed to make himself indispensable to the West. Turkey's always been indispensable to the West, but now it's Erdogan himself, I think, who is indispensable.
I should just briefly intervene and say that both Scholz and Macron, but particularly Macron, have actually tried to keep lines open to Putin. And Macron's got a lot of stick for this, particularly in the UK, for example, where there's always a kind of anti-Macron trend in the British press. But basically, Macron, he has come around a bit to the idea that we can't do anything until Ukraine has won the war. But he is also saying, as he's always said, we must acknowledge that Russia is a great European nation, and eventually we will have to do a deal. There will have to be a diplomatic solution to make peace. And he's said that against quite strong criticism, for him not being 100% pro-Ukraine. But he's another person who talks both to Putin and to Zelensky. And I wouldn't say he has good relations with Putin, because he, as we know from the documentary that was done, a sort of fly-on-the-wall documentary, he thinks Putin's a liar, as his chief diplomatic advisor said on camera. But he does have lines into both Putin and Zelensky, and he wants to use that eventually for some kind of peaceful settlement. But now he's saying that will only happen once Ukraine has got its territory back.
On Turkey, very quickly, it also has to be underlined that Turkey has enormous economic stakes in Ukraine, and that these need to be protected. I think this is the way Erdogan is thinking. I was in Lviv when Erdogan came to have talks with Zelensky. He brought half of his cabinet with him, including the head of intelligence, Minister of the Economy, huge business delegation. The biggest construction company in Ukraine right now is not a Ukrainian company, it's a Turkish one called Onur. They actually signed a deal at this summit. Turkish Airlines, pre-war, flew to more destinations within Ukraine than the flag carrier, Ukrainian Airlines. So Turkey, as well as a few other countries, are looking very closely at Ukraine's jet engine technology, motor siege, because that could be useful for the drone industry, stuff like that. So huge economic stakes in Ukraine.
Okay, questions from the floor. So, lady at the back here, gentleman here, and the guy who's got his hand up tallest there, and then we'll come to you. We will come to you at the front. Have we got microphones? Yeah.
Hello. We see multi-generational trauma impacting after conflicts such as this. We had it with World War II quite heavily. I'd be curious to know how you think that's going to impact in this case, particularly with the cannon fodder soldiers that we have coming from Russia, and how it will also impact Ukrainians and their families as well.
Okay, so we'll take 2 or 3 questions. Gentleman here. And Freddie, if you do get any from online, please chip them in. So.
Yeah, a question first for Hannah. You said that the 3 legs are going to give, one of the legs is going to give way, and I wonder which leg you think is going to give way. And a question for the panel as a whole, if I may. The Russian winter is approaching, and the Russian winter in the past seems to have worked in favour of Russia. We think Napoleon and Hitler. What about this time?
They were fighting a defensive war, weren't they?
And just so the gentleman there, and then we'll come to you. So.
Yeah, thank you all very much. My name is Ewan Grant. I used to be the old Customs and Excises intelligence analyst for the ex-Soviet states. I'm now broadcasting on the war, and in January and early February, I told the audiences on radio and TV to read 2 Tom Clancy books, command authority and commander-in-chief, one of which I shoved in front of the EU delegation in Kiev just after the Maidan. If you want to read this other book, the audience, this will tell you about Germany being bought by Russia and when it was written. My question for you all is, why did Macron ignore Wagnerism in Africa for so many years as a symbol of ignoring all the warning signs? So it's a wider thing beyond the pure issue of Wagner. Simply why? Why? I first covered Wagnerism 24 years ago. Thank you.
So yeah, so a question about Russian mercenaries. So multi-generational impact, the three legs of your stool, which you're, and a metaphor you're going to stick with, obviously now, the Russian winter, Wagner. Who wants to go first?
I think Michael better answer the one about trauma, because he's the one who's based in Ukraine. So, yeah.
Sorry, were you asking about the effect in Russia of all of these people coming back and then going home in boxes, so to speak? Look, I like to, as much as I feel as a human being, I never like to see loss of life. I used to work for UNICEF, an organization that saves lives. But I think that the consequences of this mobilization will be very bad. The numbers are very high, 300,000. And by the way, the folks being conscripted this time are not just coming from the remote areas of Russia. Basically, most of the area codes are going to be affected. Not as much, probably still St. Petersburg and Moscow. But the net is a lot bigger, so when they do start coming back, Russians are using social media, they communicate that way a lot. You could see the spark of some kind of movement, and as I mentioned earlier, of mothers. And I haven't met an authoritarian leader yet. Well, maybe there are some out there who can stand up to a force like that. The thing, I think, the technique that Putin will continue to use, however, in this new absorption of territory, I think, is the tool fear. And again, we just saw in the US response right now, I haven't read it in full, but it doesn't, I think you said it very good, is that this is a way for leaders to show that they've done something, they pat themselves on the back and said, we've done something. But I think if the mobilization doesn't produce the military, the battlefield benefit that Putin was hoping for, we're going to see two or three things. One is a continuation but acceleration of the striking of Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Someone was asking about the effect of winter. Well, the fact of the matter is that a lot of Ukraine's heating is actually above ground pipes that move steam and water. So I suspect that they're going to start bombing that and making the winter, an already difficult winter, very, very bad from a human point of view. The other thing is, and I hate to bring up the nuke word, but I wouldn't put it past Putin to perhaps experiment with that. If not, a tactical nuclear strike, and that would probably happen in an area where there's a congregation of Ukrainian soldiers, but they've gotten smart and they don't congregate many in one point, but a deliberate mistake. For example, a leak at the Zaporizhzhia plant that was produced by a strike, or even deliberately nuclear contamination that would allow Putin to say, okay, well, this area we can no longer control anymore, we're removing our troops because of humanitarian reasons. So there are a number of different scenarios here that could come into play. And I don't envy any head of state or military strategist who has to figure all of this out. But I think we have to prepare, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Hannah, which leg of the stool, and any other questions you want to address?
I'll just say something about the kind of generational trauma. I mean, I can't talk from a viewpoint of, knowing about Ukraine because I haven't reported there, but, from reporting on, the long-running conflict in eastern Turkey, I think the most important thing is reconciliation, truth and reconciliation after the conflict. And unfortunately, that's something that just doesn't happen in Turkey. And so then you see this kind of recurring cycle of violence. You get these stories of trauma. passed down from parents to children, so that children, even if they hadn't experienced it themselves, know about the trauma of their parents, and then become very, very easy to radicalise once again. So that's a kind of cycle that's happened again and again in the war between the PKK and Turkish security forces. So, I remember, like, even when the peace process was holding there before 2015, when I was going down to the east and going into people's houses to interview them, constantly on the television there would be these PKK channels where it's just constant footage of the guerrillas in the mountains in northern Iraq, and this is, I think, a result of no proper truth and reconciliation process after these conflicts. So I think that's going to be kind of key when it comes to the end stage of the conflict there. In terms of which leg's going to give way first, that's a really good question. I don't think I can give you a kind of definitive answer. I think the one that Erdogan probably cares about least at the moment is probably his standing, particularly in the US. I haven't seen any particular kind of reaction to these threats that are coming from the US about secondary sanctions. I think he knows how important he is at this point. And also, when you look at public opinion in Turkey, Turkish public don't really care about, being helpful to Russia. Overwhelmingly, Turks do support Ukraine, but when you look at foreign policy surveys, a huge number blame NATO for the war. There's this very kind of strong and long-running anti-American sentiment in Turkey that far precedes Erdogan, that then turns into an anti-NATO sentiment. So, I don't think particularly Erdogan cares about alienating the West anymore. But yeah, if it comes to, which side is he going to pick in this annexation route? Like I said, I don't think he can go back on this policy of opposing annexation. It would mean the whole unravelling of Turkey's policy when it comes to Ukraine, going back to 2014. And the fact that they do have this connection with the Crimean Tatars means that they just won't do that. I don't think that would necessarily lead to a complete unravelling of his relationship with Putin, but I do think it would tip the power balance back in Putin's favour. What we've seen in that relationship since the start of the Ukraine war is Erdogan's position in the relationship being elevated. Suddenly Putin needs Erdogan a lot more than he did before. And I think that might shift back again slightly.
It's very interesting.
Just before, can I just say, I just want to welcome Catherine in Brussels. I know you can't see our audience here, Catherine, but they can see you on a very big screen behind us, so no rude gestures from your end. I'm just going to get Victor to answer a question which has been asked, and then we'll come back to you. Victor, sorry.
Right, perfect. No, it's just interesting what you were saying about Turkish attitudes to NATO and so on. And it relates to the question about Wagner, which is the Russian mercenary group that's operating in places like Mali and the Central African Republic. I don't think we should underestimate the ability of Russia and indeed China to sort of get their narrative across and to convince people who are not in Western Europe and not in America, in the US. We tend to obviously we hear a lot of really good Ukrainian social media, which makes us happy that the Ukrainians seem to be winning the war. But we shouldn't forget that out there in the wider world, a lot of people are not necessarily thinking how great NATO is and how wonderful America is and how great Ukraine is. A lot of them are actually listening to the Russian version of events, through a lot of fake news, of course, but it's out there in the same way that they listen to the Chinese version of world events, about whether it's about the Uyghurs or anything else. So I think we just have to be a little bit careful about that. And I mean, just very briefly, I don't think the French underestimated or weren't aware of Wagner, but there wasn't much they could do about it. I mean, they hate it when you say this, but essentially Mali was their kind of mini Afghanistan, and it's been a bit of a disaster, and they've now more or less, they have pulled out of Mali now. But having said all that about the importance of the Russian kind of message getting across, and how it isn't all, the world is not completely swallowing the Western world view. Having said that, nothing succeeds like success, and it's very interesting to see the way Narendra Modi of India kind of has shifted a bit, Xi Jinping has shifted a bit, because once the Ukrainians started making these dramatic military advances, you could see that even major powers like China and India started thinking, whoa, hang on a minute, maybe our kind of so-called neutrality is not such a good idea after all. So, if the Ukrainians can continue making the kind of advances that they've made and having the kind of successes they've made, that will sort of feed into the way that other countries respond. And I think this is one of the reasons why I think if you're a Western government, it is absolutely essential that Ukraine wins this war. It cannot be allowed to stand that one country should invade and take over the entire or part of the territory of another sovereign country. It's just a violation of the post Second World War economic political order, and that just, so it can't stand. And the more the Ukrainians win, the more the rest of the world and the other members of the UN will come around to that view.
Okay, we'll take some more questions in a moment, but I just want to go to Brussels. Katrin Prebble, who's a German journalist based covering the EU and NATO, working for various German newspapers. And I guess one of the challenges in terms of how Europe contributes to Ukraine winning the war is how can it win the battle for energy supplies coming back into Europe. There's been an EU energy ministers meeting today. How united is the European policy about how to deal with an energy crisis? And also, are you hearing any more about sanctions coming out of Brussels given the announcement of the illegal annexations today?
Well, first of all, having me, and thanks for inviting. And I'm very sorry for being so late. It was indeed the energy ministers meeting, and yes, they're struggling very much. I mean, 27 countries with all their different problems, all their different dependencies, and needs, if you will, coming up with proper measures how to now help the entire bloc. I mean, they did today decide on a windfall levy on profits by fossil fuel companies, so companies which now make this massive profit, they have to pay their share. And with that money, they kind of want to support people who need it the most. But there's a lot of exemption in all those measures, once again, because as I said, it's so difficult for the EU to kind of deliver for every country. And I mean, as we know, Germany, for example, used to be very dependent on Russian gas, not so much anymore. And at the moment, of course, there is some sort of optimism because the storages are full, but no one knows how long for. And basically, all you hear all the time is savings to get through this winter. And then on the sanctions, yes, the Commission proposed this week an so-called eighth sanctions package. It's more about tying the screws a bit more on the Russian industries and economy. It's more names are on a list which get sanctions of oligarchs, but also they kind of put more sanctions on some sort of products I don't know. It's literally going from steel and iron and cosmetics and semiconductors to toilet paper, basically. Will that make the huge difference in the next weeks and coming weeks? Of course not. And the EU knows that. But it's in the long term, I guess, being seen, and just to come up, to keep the momentum in a way as well, because the big sanctions obviously were decided and proposed and in the beginning of the invasion.
And one other question, Katrin. We've had another speech from Vladimir Putin today, full of angry rhetoric, full of threats. How much impact does that have on policy making in Brussels and other European capitals? I know they say it doesn't have any, but how much does it have?
I don't think it has actually a lot of influence or impact anymore. A few months ago, the EU has decided that that's it with Russia, basically, and with the relationship. And since then, they're just trying to unlink the ties and to kind of find replacements and alternative solutions when it comes to their industries, when it comes to energy. So I mean, what I hear all the time is like, has been it with Russia, basically. In a few months' time, like no one believes any word coming from Moscow anymore. I mean, there were like all the energy ministers today here. And of course, they would always say, like, we have to now wait till we know responsible for the leaks on Nord Stream 1 and 2. I mean, they don't believe literally anything anymore what comes out of Russia, and I think especially the Commission has had like this very strong stand towards Russia and huge solidarity when it comes to Ukraine, and I think they just stick to that line. And it literally, like, you know, whatever Russia is doing now, they of course take it, you know, with some sort of caution. Like when it comes to all the threats, also we've heard in the last weeks, but I don't think this influences actually policy making anymore.
Okay, let's take another round of questions. I think one thing's interesting. I mean, Victor mentioned how important it is for the West to see Ukraine win this war. One thing, when we were talking last night, Katrin, it really struck me how you said that outsiders outside Germany don't seem to understand what a kind of almost revolutionary moment this has been for domestic German politics and its kind of sense of itself and the anger that's growing about the way energy policy has operated in Germany over the last few years, which I think is also important. Victor, you want to say something quickly?
Well, no, I just very briefly. I mean, I think in a way, one of the things that Macron said back in 2017, just after he was first elected, he made this big speech about Europe, and at the time the Germans were very dismissive of this and were very angry because he hadn't consulted them in advance about everything he was going to say. But he basically said Europe needs to be more self-sufficient, strategically, militarily, and economically. And Olaf Scholz and others, and there's another package now, have basically come around to that point of view, and they've put the money there to do exactly that. You know, we first of all had the 100 billion for rebooting, German defense, and now we have 200 billion for energy rescue policies and so on. But I mean, basically, the assertion that Germany was and other countries were too complacent about what Europe needed to do to spend and invest to reduce its dependency on the other superpowers has turned out to be true, and as and the Germans have accepted that now.
Okay, so let's take more questions.
May I add one thing?
Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting that you just said, winning the war, Ukraine winning the war. I mean, only that question, what that actually means, has been huge in Germany. We are talking on a very different, it's sometimes difficult to explain that to, especially people in Britain, where there's overall consent and consensus to, what kind of support you're giving to Ukraine, and there's not even a question on, winning means that we're going back to before 2014. In Germany, the whole discussion is a completely different one, and politicians who sort of now say we want to give more military aid, we do want more, whatever, they have to explain this up and down the country to literally everyone, because people are still really trying to adjust to new realities. And 100 billion for military, this is, a year, only beginning of February, we were talking about 4,000 helmets being sent to Ukraine, and that caused a huge discussion. Where are we now? This is crazy.
It has moved very quickly. Let's take some more questions. Christina, the gentleman here has already got a microphone, so you go first. Christina, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt.
So we've talked a little bit about conventional warfare, but in many, many ways, this is the first real cyber war that we've seen, and there's a whole element that we're not seeing or hearing about, be it on the defense of the Ukraine or offensive weapons being used against the Russians, etc. And it's really the first war where we are blind, in a sense, to some of what's going on. I'm wondering if you have any sense of the impact that's starting to have, beyond just the intelligence, but actually, being able to shut down certain things or defend against certain things not getting shut down. Any thoughts or comments on this non-conventional side of the war?
Okay, thank you. Over here.
Yeah, this was a session to respond to breaking news. I'm not sure that you meant to respond to news that broke during the session, but as Michael said, while you've been speaking, President Zelensky has made a speech asking for fast-track membership of NATO, and I wondered what you thought the effect of that would be on this.
So.
Victor, I think you nailed it by saying we can't afford to lose this war. I know Ukraine quite well. I lived as a British diplomat as well, so I won't go into that. But if that is the case, why is this subject treated as some sort of intellectual academic exercise, and we're led by a bunch of diplomats that are being bought out by Russian money, and they treat the world as a game of chess? I mean, this isn't a game of chess. We need to have something decisive. So if we're going to go with what you say, if we're going to win this war, then let's stop mucking around. So what do we need to do to get that result? And my answer is, like, we need to stop these politicians who are bought out playing games and offsetting one thing against another. There's too much diplomacy going on and not enough action is my kind of point. So without, I'm not some sort of warmonger, but I'm just thinking, what can we do to, like, get this sorted out?
Okay, who wants to go first? Michael, I mean, you've heard the questions.
Sure.
And Catherine will come to you with some thoughts if you want, but let's go to the panel here first of all.
Okay, on the NATO question, it's actually in the Ukrainian constitution that Ukraine has to aim for NATO membership, but I think a few weeks ago, starting with the Ukraine's ambassador here in London, they started kind of putting out a trial balloon saying, you know, maybe that's not that important or that urgent anymore, so we're going to cool our jets a bit on that aim. So again, that was a bit surprising that that came up today. I know Zelensky had a meeting of his National Security Council. I would hope that they have a much wider policy of how to respond than just that particular one. On the other aspects of the war, I think you will see in the next weeks very, very intensive ramping up of Russian disinformation, fake news, cyber attacks as well. I mean, the cyber attacks happen all the time. They've been happening for a long time. Ukrainian ministries are not that well defended in terms of these attacks, but I think they have new Western technology to help protect them. But a couple of things there on the kind of softer aspect of the war is, number one, I think the EU and NATO have to really increase their spending when it comes to combating fake news, misinformation, disinformation. It's really amazing to see how many people are impacted by this. In Ukraine, there's been talk started also of reconstruction rehabilitation. One of the things no one seems to be talking about these days is a topic that's I'm very passionate about, is the media sector. For Ukraine to return to where it was as a thriving democracy where, you know, a lot of business people, a lot of companies were starting to look at Ukraine as a very, very attractive investment destination. Well, if you don't have a thriving media sector to put out that information, to tell people what's going on, you're going to have big problems. Just quickly, what happened before the war is the media sector in Ukraine was not in very good shape. It was basically owned and controlled by these oligarchs. At the start of the war, the Zelensky administration insisted that all TV channels take part in what's called a 24/7 telemarathon. It's, I think, served its purpose. They should probably disband it. And the big problem with it is nobody's making any money. None of the TV channels are making any money from advertising because it's advertising free. The Ukrainian media sector right now is on life support. It's on its knees. A lot of journalists also have been displaced to European countries. So we really have to start getting that conversation going because that also is a kind of front line as well, the information front line. It needs to be very strong.
And I know that's an issue close to your heart as well. Hannah.
So all of these questions are a little bit difficult for me to answer because obviously I'm coming from the perspective of being outside of Ukraine. But just picking up on what you said about, you know, there's been a lot of talk and isn't it time for more action? I mean, you know, having reported in Syria 10 years ago and watched the kind of the traditional military campaign spearheaded by Russia there, the bombing of schools, the bombing of hospitals, the disinformation campaign, you know, no one can say that we didn't see this coming. This has been coming for a really, really long time. And, you know, I have to say that I agree with you. You know, I don't want to be a kind of warmonger either, but I think, you know, the world has let Putin get away with this stuff for a really, really long time. And this is the result. You know, he's clearly felt emboldened and empowered to do what he's done in Ukraine over the past 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of points. Most wars are not total, even though people say they are. And we have this sort of slightly peculiar situation where, yes, the Russians are threatening to use nuclear weapons, but obviously no one facing that can give in to the threat, because otherwise you would simply not fight at all. So that's a kind of, in a way, it's an empty threat. Not that it's not going to be carried out, but it can't possibly have any impact on the behavior of either Ukraine or the West, because, otherwise we would just give up today. So that's.
And yet it does have impact, doesn't it? If in Germany, for example, people fear nuclear,
it may have an
yeah,
absolutely. It may have an impact on public opinion, which then has an impact on policy. But I think in terms of sort of immediate impact on military policy or government policy, it can't have an immediate impact. The other thing about not having total war is, I mean, we're in a very peculiar situation where Russia is attacking Kiev and Odessa and everywhere else in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are not openly able to attack Moscow or anywhere else, which in a total war they would completely do. And obviously it's complicated because, they're not allowed to use US weapons to attack Russian soil. We think they have attacked Russian soil just over the border at some, fuel depots and arms depots. But I mean, again, it's not impossible to imagine a situation where the Ukrainian leadership would say, actually, now is the time for a dramatic strike inside Russia, because why not? They're attacking us, and we should attack them. So I think it's another. So until now, this has not been total war. It's been extremely brutal and extremely bloody, but we haven't seen how bad it could get. And just lastly, on the second to last on the NATO issue, I think Zelensky he's a very good diplomat, if you like, or propagandist. I mean, he's handled the rest of the world brilliantly, I think. He's sort of greeted them, shamed them, every single day, I think, since the invasion began. He's been able to take center stage and make people like Macron and Scholz look sort of embarrassedly at their feet and say, oh shit, what should I do now? And I think this is obviously what the West will say is, yes, of course, eventually, maybe you can be a member of NATO, but not yet, which is exactly what they did with the EU membership. They were very reluctant because they didn't want to have yet another member of the EU, which would make it more than 28 people trying to agree. But obviously, politically, they had to say, yes, we think in the long run it's a good idea. On cyber war, I mean, the problem is, by its very nature, it's secret. And I just go back to my point about I think the Ukrainians are benefiting a great deal from stuff that we don't know about in terms of Western intelligence, and probably also, as you were saying, cyber support. The slightly related issue of social media and the use of the internet for propaganda, which we've referred to every now and then, I think is really interesting. I mean, the Russians have done a lot, but they've been very unsuccessful in the West, I think. Even in places like France, where they previously had a lot of sympathizers because they basically are so obviously lying. The Ukrainians have been absolutely brilliant. But again, that doesn't necessarily work in Latin America or in Africa, but it certainly works in the West. And we've all been, journalists are very impressed by the way in which Zelensky and the Ukrainians generally have used social media to very, very brilliant effect. I mean, my cousin's a farmer, and she was just loving the memes at the beginning of the war about Ukrainian farmers with their tractors towing away Russian tanks that have been abandoned by their crews. So this is, that kind of stuff is just, it's superb, but it doesn't necessarily, it has a big effect on Western public opinion, but the question is whether it will have an effect on other public opinion elsewhere.
Catherine, you're in Brussels, NATO headquarters. I'm guessing you'd probably agree with what Victor said, that it won't make much difference to NATO policy. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. I just wanted to ask you about something that's happening next week, when there's this summit of this Macron idea, the European political community. Liz Truss is supposed to be going to Prague, if she's still Prime Minister by then, of course. And Erdogan, I'm not sure, possibly, but I wonder whether, is this just another layer of something which will bring Ukraine into the fold while keeping it at arm's length from both NATO and the EU?
I think it's some sort of secure or mechanism also for countries like France, to not give in to smaller countries, like at the moment, Baltic countries, which ask for enlargement and who very much insist on it. And because of the war in Ukraine at the moment, that topic, that issue came right on top of the agenda again. And then you have some countries in Europe completely frustrated because the process has been going on for such a long time. But at the moment, there's no chance that Ukraine, I mean, it's quite similar now to the NATO thing. Politically, yes, and the European Union has to draw them closer to them and to the Union, to not lose them to Russia or the influence of Russia, but at the same time they're not ready to join the EU. So what do you do? And I think it's a quite smart move to now, sort of come up and establish a community where not only, I don't know, Serbia or Ukraine or Montenegro would be inside, but also countries like Britain, frankly, or Switzerland. So I think, there's a lot of reluctance from especially the Eastern European member states. And of course, when you speak to Ukrainian politicians, they call it almost like a ghetto of the EU. So they're not very happy, I guess. But I think it's a more realistic way. And that has also to do with how the EU works. There's so many decisions which have to be made unanimously. How does that going to work with 35 member states, for example? So either you talk about enlargement, but then you have to talk about reforming the entire European Union, and I cannot see that coming anytime soon, I must say.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. More questions. Two here, and then the lady over there. Mike? The two, right? Oh, you've got one here. Yeah.
One country that's been absent from this discussion has been China. And China, from time to time, has come up as being very important in the fact that I'm sure, I don't know, that they have warned Russia that should nuclear arms be used, there would be very serious consequences to any trade that they might have. And world stability is extremely important to China. And they've let that be known as well. So I was wondering, have any of you had any reflections about this, or the influence, or the role that China might play, actually, in this whole matter? Thank you.
I'm still very unclear as to what are the minimum conditions we would accept for victory, and what victory is going to look like. If it's going to include the return of Crimea to the Ukraine, I think even those Russians who are rather ambivalent about the war are going to say, no way. So, at what point are we willing to declare victory, and at what point will we lift sanctions? Because if these sanctions go on for 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, Europe is not going to look anything like it is today.
Mike, coming.
What we don't hear very much about is the people in Ukraine themselves, the people who haven't left. You've mentioned water and gas infrastructure being exposed because it's above the soil. You've mentioned having an air raid alarm on your phone, Michael. But are schools open? Are kids going to school? Is there bread in the shops? Are the courts functioning? What is life like?
Who wants to go first?
Sure.
Michael, the microphone is raised.
Start with the last one. It's a very, very good question. Yeah. Actually, I've been in Ukraine since before the war started, and what has really amazed me and other observers is how the Ukrainian infrastructure has kept on going. For example, social payments, the banking system. In terms of schools, they were distance learning. It was actually almost an extension of the pandemic practice. But now in September, there was a back-to-school campaign. However, it depends who you talk to, but I think a fairly reliable figure is about 30 to 40% of Ukrainian schools only have bomb shelters. And I got to tell you, those missiles travel pretty fast. I've seen them with my own eyes, and sometimes they don't even trigger the air raid siren alarm. So having an on-site bomb shelter is really, really important in terms of continuation of schooling. There are other sectors which have really struggled, and I'm sorry, I forgot to mention the other reason the back to school campaign suffered a bit is a lot of teachers have fled, to other areas. A big need right now, if any of you are wondering where to perhaps direct your support or your donations, is to the hundreds of thousands of internally displaced Ukrainians who have remained in Ukraine. There's a huge need ahead of the wintertime of repurposing empty dormitories, schools, and buildings into semi-permanent shelter for these internally displaced people. I have a policy of not putting one organization in front of the other, but one to look at is, for example, moveukraine.org. They're a collection of architects and urbanists who are working really fast to create that the proper conditions for internally displaced people. So what was the other question?
We have one about what victory looks like.
Well, do you want to?
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I would say about the victory looking like is that I don't think there's any way that anyone is going to discuss this openly and frankly until Russia is very much on the defensive and virtually defeated. I mean, you're not going to have Ukraine saying, yeah, we can live without Crimea, until the time comes for that kind of negotiation to happen. I mean, it's not up to me, is it? It's up to the Russians and the Ukrainians, really. This is the issue, right? It's Ukrainian territory. That the Crimea has never been recognized as Russian territory by anybody except possibly Belarus. So I mean, but I think a lot of diplomats, certainly at the beginning of the war, assumed that maybe if Russia could be driven back to the lines where it first started, then maybe some kind of negotiation could be achieved on that basis, which is what happened in 2014. There was a kind of an attempt at having a sort of negotiated settlement to the issue of eastern Ukraine, although not Crimea. But I think things have moved so much beyond that now that, I mean, you're in Ukraine, right? The Ukrainians are not going to accept anything like that now.
Correct, and I think what has been very interesting is these explosions and attacks within Crimea. It does now appear that Ukrainians had special forces there on the ground from the beginning of the war to be able to make these attacks happen. I mean, it was stunning to see. It was humiliating. I have to be careful what I say because I am going back to Ukraine, but I do hear from ordinary Ukrainians is, when are we going to take a strike at that Kerch Bridge, which links Crimea with the Russian mainland? That is a very tantalizing...
That's one on the other side.
Yeah, on the other side. It's a very tantalizing target in the view of a lot of Ukrainians. It was a very expensive piece of infrastructure. So we may see that happen. On China, I think we saw, for example, as far back as the pandemic, that one trend about dictators is they tend to watch each other. They tend to learn from each other. And I think Xi Jinping has been watching Putin closely and vice versa. Of course, I've got to be careful what I say because Victor's an old Asian hand here, but I think the Chinese dragon stomach is grumbling really loudly, and that they're very keen to reunify Taiwan. Probably sooner than they think. I think part of the Chinese calculation of the supreme leader is that maybe this Russia-Ukraine war will ratchet up, the West will be distracted. That is the time to move in. And I think, if I'm Xi Jinping and I'm looking at the West's response, especially the United States, so what? Sanctions here and there, it's not going to hurt us. I know for a fact that China and Russia have been working very hard during the pandemic when everyone else was distracted to start inoculating themselves against things like sanctions, connecting their economies even closer, including talk about a currency. It was very interesting when the so-called coup happened in Kazakhstan. Russia was allowed to huff and puff for a few days, and I think a signal was sent from Beijing to Putin, okay, that's enough, take your guys out. Because China is a very, very pragmatic country. Energy security, energy independence, food security is very important. And by the way, they had very deep economic ties in Ukraine pre-war. In fact, Zelensky held a call with Xi Jinping and he hung up the phone and said, China is our greatest economic partner anywhere.
May I add something.
One second, we'll come back to you, Catherine, in a second. I was just going to say, I mean, the idea that Russia can sort of say we don't need Europe anymore because we can just send our gas east to China. The pipeline infrastructure simply doesn't exist on the level they need.
It doesn't exist yet, but the oil, which is actually most of the income, is actually obviously very fungible and can be shipped and is being shipped, albeit at lower prices. But just very briefly, the point about China and Taiwan is exactly why, another reason why the West is absolutely determined to win this war convincingly, or to have Ukraine win the war convincingly, because for exactly that reason. I mean, the other day, as I mentioned, I did mention China actually a bit earlier, but both Modi of India and Xi Jinping of China obviously told Putin after he'd suffered those reverses in northeastern Ukraine that, what was he, they asked him what the hell he was doing, because once you're on the run, your fellow dictators get nervous about their own positions. And I mean, Putin himself was the one who actually spoke. I think this was at a Shanghai cooperation meeting. He said, I have explained to Mr. Xi Jinping that, we will try to end the war as soon as possible. I mean, he was obviously very much on the defensive, and Modi said, this is not a time for war. Well, I mean, that was a very, very clear rebuke to Putin. But it only came after the Russians had been very heavily defeated in that advance by the Ukrainians.
Yeah, Catherine, we're starting to run out of time, so just briefly.
Just add, because I was actually in Taiwan only a few weeks ago, and it's quite striking how closely they are watching what's going on in Europe, of course, with sanctions. And yet they also know that we're all in trouble if something's happening, because when we now say or talk about dependencies on Russia, I mean, that is nothing compared to how dependent we are on China. So they're not very optimistic that Europe would go as far when it comes to sanctions. But I do find it very interesting how the narrative has changed completely on China over the last years. A few years ago, it was still like a partner. It was sort of like, we make business with China, whatever. And now, not only NATO, but also the EU sees it as a very, almost a threat and a big challenge. And they're very much aware of what they're doing now regarding Russia and Ukraine is sort of keeping them away maybe, or at least showing them, if you attack Taiwan, this is, there will be huge consequences. It's for Europe, very much if we let Russia sort of win any sort of millimeter, this will have a huge effect on China as well, of course. So the sanctions are not only towards Russia, but very much towards China too.
Absolutely. Okay, we only have a couple of minutes left, so so let's take the three questions at the back, and then this will be the last round. So.
Yes, as President Zelensky said, Budapest Memorandum not work now. So, as some Western European leaders prepare to react in real, it's time to action, because now we're waiting for a nuclear attack.
Okay, there's a comment. Do you have
Western European politicals ready for this? Are they prepared? What they doing?
Okay. And there are two questions over here.
I was just wondering if you could talk about the incident with the Nord Stream pipeline and whether you think that sort of subterfuge attack on energy infrastructure is going to become more common as we move forward, and how should NATO and Europe respond to that?
The question about it's Iran, and the role is they're supporting the wars in Syria and obviously against Ukraine as well. Why aren't the Western leaders supporting the biggest uprising in Iran after the revolution?
Okay, actually, as there's only one other hand up, we'll take 4 questions and then we'll try and wrap it all into one.
Thank you. So the question will be following. If Putin will feel that he's cornered, previously he was thrown back from the Kharkiv. Then he was thrown back more previously from Kiev. So if he will feel that he's cornered, how high the possibility is that he will use the nuclear weapon, because he already told that in case he might, because that will open obviously Pandora's box, and the other countries might see as well that if Putin is allowed to do it, then why not we cannot do it. So what are the possible answer of Europe mind before this, and what scenario we might face in the nearest future? Thank you.
Okay, I mean, who would have thought even a couple of years ago that we'd be in an era where we're having a serious discussion about nuclear war in Europe, but we are. So, I mean, a variety of questions there. With respect, I'm not quite sure we were here to talk about Iran, but if anyone wants to answer the question, of course, I'm only happy for them to do so. But who wants to go first?
Iran, I'll just say this, and the Atlantic Council recently, about a week ago, had a panel on PS 752. A lot of people have forgotten about that, but that was the Ukrainian Airlines Boeing 737 that was shot down by Iran over Tehran. It's still an open case. The Iranians are not cooperating whatsoever, so this is still a very sensitive issue with the Ukrainians. Then I think on the pipeline, my theory is that was probably a deliberate strike by the Russians. They were acting in what my friend from the American Enterprise Institute, Elizabeth Brawl, calls the gray zone, where you do things, you can get away with it. People may not think you did it, but you did it for a purpose. It's the same thing almost as the Chinese. They very quietly but deliberately overfish in waters that aren't theirs, or they dig up a lot of sand areas near Taiwan to make that, they not only need the sand for land reclamation, the Spratly Islands area, but they do it as a kind of economic harm type of thing. So I don't think we've heard the end of the story on the pipeline, but I think the Russians may have even said to themselves, it's not that useful to us anymore, so let's create a bit of trouble.
They're not using it, and they're not going to use it, right? Yeah.
Hannah?
I'm going to defer to Victor on this, because
Okay.
again, it's not exactly my area of specialty.
Which one? Yeah, Iran, I think probably, I mean, very briefly, obviously this is seen as an internal conflict. So that doesn't mean that the West doesn't completely sympathize, or most Western governments would completely sympathize with the protesters in Iran, and I'm sure they've said so. But it, at the moment, doesn't involve the invasion of another country. So, you know, the sort of reason why this war is so significant is because it's involved, you know, as I said at the beginning, as sort of the invasion of a sovereign state by another sovereign state. And that's why we're in this kind of mess now. And I think, as one of my fellow participants said just now, just the fact that we did nothing, the world did nothing in 2014 when Crimea and Donetsk were taken over. That is, you know, that's the problem we're facing now, is that finally people have decided this far and no further. Which is why it was extraordinary in a way that Putin did what he did. Because if he had simply, you know, tried to take a bit more of eastern Ukraine or make that land bridge to Crimea, probably the West would have reacted as it did in 2014. But the fact that he went straight for Kiev just set off alarm bells in everybody's heads. It's a bit like if the Iraqis in 1990 had simply crossed the border and taken the disputed oil field in north of Kuwait. Nothing much would have happened. There would have been a few protests, there would have been, you know, maybe sanctions, but nothing much would have happened. But the fact that Saddam Hussein sent his people straight into Kuwait City and just took over the whole country, that meant that in not just the US, but actually the whole UN Security Council mandated, you know, an army led by the US, but with allies that included, people have forgotten this, countries like Syria and Egypt, to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait, which is what happened. So there's a big difference between you know, a domestic political uprising in any country, even a country as important as Iran, and a war that involves one country attacking another. And this is by far the biggest such situation that we've seen in Europe since the Second World War, and one of the largest in the world, probably.
Very quickly, because I'd like to end on a positive. I think I wrote a piece for CNN Opinion about this, about how language has been a factor in this war on the ground in Ukraine. One of the indirect kind of consequences of Mr. Putin's actions is he's actually drawn Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers much, much closer together. I, for example, have been spending a lot of time in Odessa. I meet a lot of Russian speakers there who now deliberately switched over to Ukrainian because they feel it's so important. You see on almost every building now in Odessa, Ukrainian flags on them. We never saw that before. So, you know, Ukrainians tell me we're now getting to know each other in a way we never have before, because you had this divide between East and West. But for example, 250,000 internally displaced people coming to Lviv a lot of them from the west, from the east, the center, and the south. They're being integrated into Ukrainian schools, things like that. So I think this is going to be a long-term positive for Ukraine, and it's another reason why it's responded in a way that the Russians didn't even think or expect. So.
Okay, I'm going to give the last thought, Catherine. I don't know if you could hear the questions, but I wonder whether one of them was sort of along the lines of, do you think Europe is ready for a longer war than perhaps they might have expected, and one which is probably going to get worse before it gets better?
I mean, that's certainly what a lot of people think. But like maybe on a different thought on this, I think it's quite interesting that not only when it comes to NATO, but also the European Union, that the aggression, with his aggression, Putin has literally unified this union so much more, and there's more solidarity than ever. There's more a sense of why we need the European Union. I know not very popular saying that in Britain, but you know, that like that sense that it needs solidarity, and you can only do everything together, at least like, you know, when it comes to now also sanctions and everything, has been as strong as never, I think. And like when you now look at like, you know, kind of not only the response, but what kind of thoughts and ideas they have, that like, you know, it was a wake-up call that Europe needs to get, get like a proper own strategy when it comes to security and defense, and this has been now debated more than ever. So I think, like this will have changed the European Union forever in a way, and Europe.
Catherine, thank you very much. We've run over time, so thank you all for coming. I want to thank the panelists here as well, Victor, Hannah, and Michael. Thanks for your questions, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.